Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or traditional. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. In this week's Torah reading is Rabbi, and the Torah prohibits us from adding or detracting to its directives and also against rewriting history. It even warns that there might be a time where our leaders try to reinvent our past. So hop into your time machine and join us as we discuss a time that never was. Well, welcome. We are broadcasting from the Franco-American timeline. The Rabbi is in Gay Paris, and I am in Connecticut. Thank you all for joining us. And we are getting towards the end of the Torah here, and we are in, as I said in the intro, the Parsha of Rabbi, and it really covers a lot of good stuff. It starts with a little tease about a blessing and a curse and the whole Mount Gerizim and Har Abel thing that we're going to have soon, but doesn't really go there. Then it starts talking, as it's thinking about coming into the land, of destroying the altars that are there, and it's focused on centralizing Judaism so that the idea is that you should only worship God in the designated appointed place and destroy all of the altars of the non-Jews. And then it talks about how do you eat meat outside of that designated place, talks about false prophets, gets into kosher rules, gets into tithes, the sabbaticals, and holidays. So it's really got a lot of stuff. But we, as is our due, are going to focus on something that could literally fall through the cracks. And that is in Deuteronomy 12:29. It says as follows: "When your God has cut down before you the nations that you are about to enter and dispossess, and you have dispossessed them and settled in their land, v'yarashta otam, v'yashavta ba'aratzam. Beware of being lured into their ways after they have been wiped out before you. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, 'How did those nations worship their gods?' I too will follow these practices," you will say. "You shall not act thus towards your God, for they perform for their gods every abhorrent act that God detests. They even offer up their sons and daughters to fire to their gods." So this is very strange. It really struck my attention because we've heard so many times about being influenced by the Canaanites, by the idol worshippers that are in the land. But here it's talking about a situation where you've already dispossessed them and you've settled in the land. And it really is talking about don't start looking kind of like an archaeologist, I would seem, or maybe a theologian curious about ancient practices. Beware of being lured into the ways. Do not inquire about their gods. It says, Tidrosh le'Elohechem. And the commentaries are either very silent or there's one commentary that I found, Rabbeinu Bachaya, who really does point this out. He says, what's the logic here? You've already destroyed them. When you beat somebody and they lose a war, you hardly want to imitate them. So what's going on here? And he says this is a prohibition. Even the inquiry into details of the former inhabitants' religious worship is forbidden. So it's almost forbidden to do what we do so many times here at Madlik, which is we look into context and history and practices of other people.
So your point is a very important point, and that is that, chronologically, the way the Torah is set up, this is Moses speaking to the people before they enter the land. But because Moses is not going to enter the land, He talks to them as if they're already in the land and they have all the challenges of being in the land. Now, the idea of kosher is a very interesting thing. Just to take one thing that you mentioned. The idea of kosher is not mentioned here for the first time. It's mentioned in the book of Vayikra. But in the book of Vayikra, it means something very different. Because in the desert, the only time the Jews were allowed to eat meat was if they sacrificed the sacrifice. They sacrificed the sacrifice, and then they ate meat as part of the sacrifice. It was only when they entered the land, when the borders became too great, too wide, and they weren't able to get to Jerusalem every night where they wanted to have hamburgers, that they were allowed to eat from the meat even without sacrifices. So even something like that, Geoffrey, and I think that's an interesting point that you make, even something like that, the laws of kosher, which we know from before, but they have a completely different meaning now because they're talking about a different situation, a situation that that's not limiting, but actually is expanding.
So I totally agree. Everything is now focused on going into the land. But what I took away from this is this was one step further. This imagines, prophesizes, if you will, a time where you're successful, where there are no pagans in the land. Either they've converted or they've left or what else could have happened to them, but they're not there. And it really, the commentaries kind of focus on this, is what exactly is being prohibited here. And I think either looking at the few commentators like I did, like Rabbeinu Bachaya, or just looking at it as we do, you gotta think it's strange. The question is, why would you, number one, want to inquire about the gods of these unsuccessful inhabitants, and what is the concern about inquiring? That I do think we have an inkling. It says if you inquire, then you might start acting like them. And keep in mind, they go so far as to offer their children to their gods. But it is, to me anyway, it struck me as strange. And I think that for once the rabbinic authorities either didn't have much to say about it, or when they did, the best they could really come up with is maybe don't be curious, don't be looking back. But I want to continue on this thread in our Parsha, because if you go to verse 13, the next chapter right after this, it says, "Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it nor take away from it. Lo tosif alav velo tigra mimenu." And this, of course, is a little bit of a parallel, because you would think from the earlier statement that you might be tempted to say, well, exactly how did they pray and how did they deal with their tabernacle architecture? Maybe we should take some of the beauty that we can see in the full instructions around this idea of adding to the Torah, and clearly of taking away where we have requirements, as you mentioned, kashrut, Shabbat, all of the things that are mentioned. Don't take those away. In historical perspective, I think this has been used as a double-edged sword. Correct me if I'm wrong. Not adding would really protect us from zealots who want to increase. I think Rashi's example that he gives is, for instance, to place 5 chapters in the Tefillin, to employ 5 species of fruits. So Rashi's focused on a quantitative addition. But the idea is, don't be a machmir, don't be a fanatic and crazy and start in adding certain things. And detracting would be the typical argument against the reformers, the Enlightenment, where they would take away from the commandments and say this is not necessary, it's the spirit of the Lord. But do you see there's kind of a correlation, a train of thought here between the two statements that we're working on so far?
I think that's all really good. And there are 2 points you just made. The first point is why people would be tempted towards idolatry. It's interesting. The Talmud says that there are two big yetzer haras, 2 things that people, desire. One thing is sexual promiscuity, and the other is idolatry. And the Gemara says that the yetzer hara for avodah zarah disappeared, but the yetzer hara for sexual promiscuity, that's still there. And the question is, why is that so? So why is it that nowadays we're not interested in idolatry, but then they were interested in idolatry? And I think you have to understand something about what idolatry offers that monotheism, that one God doesn't offer. When somebody's sick, we pray to God. When we go on a trip and we want to be safe, we pray to God. When we want to be successful in business, we pray to God. It's the same God we pray to. In idolatry, everything has its own God. Like the Greek god Poseidon, when they went on a trip across the ocean, they weren't going on planes then, but when they had a trip across the ocean, they went to Poseidon. When they got married, they went to the god of love. When they got sick, they went to the god of healing. And there was something extremely, desirable about this idea that everybody had a personal God. It's kind of like the way you feel when you're sick. If you have a very specific, God forbid someone has a specific, problem, they don't want to go to the general practitioner, right, Geoffrey? That was in our parents' or grandparents' generation, that everybody went to the GP and he or she solved all the problems. Now you want the specialist. You want the specialist who's the specialist of the specialist of the specialist, who only deals with exactly what your problem is. The truth of the matter is that that's the same thing with gods. We want a God who was a specialist. And that's really why there was a yetzer hara. And that's why the Torah says, don't go after their gods. They looked at these people and they said, hey, maybe something's right, because they seem to be living a good life and they have very specific gods. That's number one. Number 2 is the idea of not to add and not to subtract. Obviously, that is at the core of everything Jewish, because that's the whole tradition of the evolution of the law. Obviously, the law has been added to and has been subtracted from. Just take the littlest things, right? The fact that we sell our chametz before Pesach is an addition to the law. The fact that we, avoid the laws of the Shemitah, the 7th sabbatical year, by selling the land to a non-Jew is an addition to the law, or a subtraction from the law. So what is it exactly that's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And why, when the Reform movement came around and they said, we're going to cut out parts of the prayers and these kinds of things, why was that? How did everybody know that was not acceptable? Maybe that was part of the acceptance. And this is really, this law of don't add and don't subtract is really about rabbinic authority. That's what it's all about. It's about who makes the rules. And the amazing thing is that according to tradition, the Torah was written 3,300 years ago. And we are still in 2022 arguing about that point. Who makes the rules? I'll just tell you a funny Paris story. Sharon and I were walking down the street this afternoon, and we overheard some young woman who was on her cell phone. And of course, we Americans always talk too loud. So she was on her phone, and we heard her say Maharat for Shabbos. And we stopped her and say, well, what are you talking about Maharat for here in Paris? And it seems to me that there is a Maharat in Paris, and she's my student. And we're going there for Shabbos lunch. And this young woman is invited, and she was telling her mother that she's going to Maharat for Shabbos lunch. Now, that's just kind of funny, this small world that we live in. But, that's an example. Who says that women can't be rabbis? Why is that an addition to the law that the Orthodox won't accept, while, selling your chametz is something that they will accept? So this idea of adding and subtracting to the law is something that we're still fighting about to this very day.
I love the fact that you're all the way in Paris and you heard about Maharat, the school that you teach at that trains women rabbis in the Orthodox tradition. That small world is the only term that comes to mind. So I think you're right, and I love the fact that you bring in things that are across the border, because in Deuteronomy 13:7, it repeats kind of with a new nuance the prohibition about taking customs and worship rites from the pagans. It says, if your brother, your own mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your closest friend entices you in secret, saying, come, let us worship other gods, whom neither you nor your ancestors have experienced, from among the gods of the peoples around you, either near to you or distant, anywhere from one end of the earth to the other, do not assent or give heed to them. So again, I believe this is totally new territory, because up until now, we've been concerned with the pagan practices that they are being exposed to. Don't let your kids marry someone from the Canaanites, all of that stuff. And here the field of vision is so much larger. There's this issue of secret, which we're going to have to deal with. But even before we get there, it's a movement of people, but it has stuff that not even your ancestors. This isn't even the paganism that Abraham rejected, or that you might have seen maybe in Egypt. It's the field of vision is so much larger. And I'm going to ask you to comment, and then I'm going to give you what I believe is the historical back context for these paragraphs. But do you agree with me that there's something strange and different in this prohibition than other ones that we've seen heretofore?
Yes, I think it's right, and I'm gonna pause for a second to listen to your historical analysis, because I think that's what it's really all about here. What's the background for these paragraphs? So why don't you shoot with the history, and then we'll talk about it.
So thank you. So as you know, when we started reading Devarim, we really said it is a totally different voice, a totally different book. The modern scholarship believes it was discovered much. Well, the Torah itself talks about it being discovered, and in the books of Tanakh, there are those that say that it was during the reign of King Josiah. But in any case, it has a different vision. And it seems to me, I am reading what is the first popular history of the Jewish people by a guy named Heinrich Graetz. We Jews love history, but we don't necessarily study history. And what he has two things that struck me that I read recently that really kind of put this into context. The first is a king from the tribes of Judah called Jeroboam. And he ruled 977 to 955. And what he did is that he started to take control, and he used religion as a way of gaining control of all the people. I'm going to read a little bit from Graetz. He was the only man of ability and daring, and an Ephraimite from the tribe of Ephraim. They readily fell into his scheme, and he introduced other tribes to join. To obviate the need of pilgrimages to the temple. Remember, we just came through the Torah saying you have to make the pilgrimage to the centralized temple, to which the people had been accustomed and in which there lurked a political danger. Jeroboam hit upon a mischievous scheme which was to lead Israel back into idolatry. During his sojourn in Egypt, Jeroboam became acquainted with the animal worship of the Egyptians and learned the stupefying effects it had upon people. The introduction of Apis worship in Egypt and effect on the Israelites would render them more tractable, and in addition would raise Jeroboam in the favor of the Egyptians. So there was domestic politics involved, and there was foreign politics involved. Moreover, Jeroboam determined to pose as a restorer of the ancient religion of Israel, and not as the creator of a new one. In Egypt and later in his own countries, they worshipped sacred bulls, and it goes into detail how this King Jeroboam consolidated a political party by leading a false movement of returning to a past that never existed, and he was successful. There was another king, Manasseh of Judah, who was 200 years later, who did very similar things. He promoted idolatry. Again, I'm reading from grades throughout the kingdom, built pagan temples, and even sacrificed on his sons on the fires of Malach. There's a tradition that he killed Isaiah. So I think as you read these, and I would love you to go to the Sephira notes and read in detail what Graetz wrote and others wrote, I think that puts a totally new face on what we just read. This wasn't pure speculation. If you're a traditional Jew and you believe that Devarim was spoken by Moses, it was prophesizing this period where these dastardly kings would go ahead and manipulate the past and try, first in secret amongst friends and family, and then move it out where they would consolidate power and use a religion that they imported from afar to do this. It seems to me that if you get a sense of history and you know the history of, for instance, these two kings, who, by the way, preceded the king who found under his role, he did a true return to Tshuva, or a true return to our religion, and he is responsible for bringing the book of Devarim to the fore. To me, I feel like I've been robbed. I had never realized this part of Jewish history. And once you read it, and then you read the verses that we just read in Devarim, it puts them in a totally different context. It's talking about real situations that will happen prophetically or did happen.
So that, first of all, thank you to Graetz. I'm happy that you're reading Graetz because, the history of the prophetic period or the kingdom is really the history of monotheism, the belief in the one God, the Jewish God in the case of the prophets, and idolatry. And what you see is, and unless you read it, Geoffrey, you can't really believe it, you see the pull that idolatry had on people. It had on people, it had on kings, and that how complete societies were actually idol worshippers. I'm going to tell you something else that's interesting. I don't know if Graetz mentions this, but, we have the tradition in the Torah about the golden calf. It was the worst sin of the Jewish people. We know from archaeology now that during the time of the first temple, the Jews, the Jews committed to God, committed to the temple, committed to the prophet, committed to the king, they actually had little idols, little golden calves at home. And they used them to worship God, the Jewish God. So what you see is that idolatry was so strong that even the good guys used idolatry sometimes to help them with their religion. So you see exactly what you said, what the pull of idolatry was all about. And you kind of understand, during the end of the first temple, the 10 tribes, they went north and they basically broke away. And then they were captured by Sancherib and then they were dispersed. And we don't know anything about them. And what we have is really the tribes of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. So what we really have is we only have 2 out of the 12 tribes have remained for everybody, or maybe 3 because Levi also was there, because idolatry gobbled up the other tribes, Geoffrey. That's an amazing thing. Think about that. Idolatry literally gobbled up 9 of the 12 tribes.
It is totally amazing, and the other parallel aspect of it is how closely linked politics and religion were. It's not a modern phenomenon. Certainly anyone who studied the papacy knows that, but the point is that if Graetz is even 80% correct in his treatment of these two kings, and he, by the way, does not make the connection to the book of Devarim. It was just that kind of small world moment where I'm reading the Parsha and I'm reading Graetz, and it just pulled out of it fell out of the page. It leaped out of the page. That in fact, you couldn't get a better explanation of the strange verses that we just started with than to understand that there were going to be leaders who were going to reach near and far, who were going to pretend that this was an earlier religion, that they were reformers, so to speak, and were going to use it. And yes, the outcome is tribes were lost. The whole tapestry of the Israelite tribes was broken over this. And as we end, what I would like to do is to bring this up to date, because I think it's very clear that not only from the beginning has politics and political power, diplomacy, and religion been very united. We see it even today. There are two books that I quote in the notes on Sefaria. One it's called Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. And of course, you, Rabbi, talked about the halachic aspect of this, but there are also, the book is written by a real deep scholar, and the other book is The Uses of Tradition, Jewish Continuity in Modern Era, and it brings an amazing story there. And it's the story that in Israel, there was a great scholar named the Chazon Ish. And this story is called the Lost Kiddush Cup. And he decided that there was a particular shear, there was a particular measurement that the Kiddush Cup had to be yotzeh, to fulfill the obligations of making Kiddush. And one of the students took his words very seriously, and he went home and he brought back the Kiddush Cup that his great-grandfather, who was a major scholar in Poland, used. And guess what? Didn't have the right shiur. It wasn't large enough to hold the wine that the Chazon Ish wanted. And he uses this as an example, and it goes on to say there was a whole to-do because they found the Kiddush cup of the Chafetz Chaim, and it also wasn't large enough. And the scholar who wrote the book uses this to explain how we constantly are rewriting history, and we have to be careful of it. And first of all, you have to identify it, and then you have to be careful of it, because as the verse said, you can't add or detract from these things. But I think the most important thing is we have to be aware of it. And it's so important to understand not only what's added and what's not, but sometimes what the motivations are. And I think that becomes very powerful. And in the state of Israel, where religion at the end of the day is playing a very large role, we can definitely see how secular leaders are able to use tag words of religion and to sway people, and it's something that I think needs to be studied and at times called out. That, to me, is how up to date these warnings are, and not simply about adding a few laws here and there, but changing the whole fabric.
That is fantastic. So I think what you see here, and it's really more true in Devarim, these portions in Devarim than anywhere else, is that the issues that affected the Jewish people 3,000 years ago are still the issues that affect us today. And we can learn both from the mistakes that were made in the past and the things that people did right. And you talk about the Chazon Ish and the Chazon Ish's Kiddush cup, and you talk about women rabbis and all of these kinds of things. It's really amazing to see how we still argue about it. But we should gain strength, just end on a nice note. We should gain strength in the fact that the Jewish tradition is alive, and that on Clubhouse we can still argue and discuss these same issues, and that makes us stronger and that makes us better. So whether you're in Paris, the East Coast, or anywhere in between, have a Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy the Parasha Chodesh Tov. It's the beginning of the month of Elul. Rosh Hashanah is right around the corner. Enjoy, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week at our regularly scheduled time, 8 o'clock on the East Coast, Eastern Daylight Time. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, Geoffrey.
Shabbat Shalom, au revoir, Rabbi, and enjoy and take notes from Paris. And for the rest of us, yes, let's realize how up to date the Torah is always, and keep our focus on strange little pictures and visions that occur, and try to get to the bottom of them. Be sure to look for the Madlik podcast. Give us some stars, say something nice, and with that, I will say au revoir from Connecticut. Shabbat Shalom.